the late, great Michael Grail, who was editor of the Commercial Appeal, used to say if you scratch at any story long enough and hard enough that race was at its core. And I pretty much found this to be true in covering the South for 37 years. I used to be real optimistic and think if enough old mossbacks died, then things would improve. Well, that was wrong. That hasn't happened. And what I've seen, really more to the point, is that I grew up in Alabama of George Wallace, and the same euphemisms he was using in 1963, Reagan adopted in 1980. You know, he was talking about welfare mothers and the meddling federal government, and there's not a dime's worth of difference between the parties. And now we're hearing it from the Tea Party candidates. But it's the same old stuff. It's just, it's Wallace's playbook. And so there's this repetition that you find, and I'm not sure that enough deaths is going to cure all the problems. In 1984, I was on my way back from Camp Lejeune, and I flew into the Atlanta airport, and I picked up a paper, and there was an Associated Press story. It was just a couple of graphs, but it got my attention because it was real near where I was living in Counce, Tennessee at the time. And the story said that the county, Lawrence County, Alabama, was refusing, that the supervisors were refusing, county commissioners, I think, were refusing to allow a statue of native son Jesse Owens to be put on the courthouse lawn. And again, this is 1983 or 4, I forget which. And I thought, and the quote from one of the men on the commission was, if we allow this, it will just let down the floodgates and everybody will want a statue on the courthouse lawn. Yeah, everybody that one-upped Hitler, I guess. The story just got better and better, actually, from a newspaper point of view. A group of elderly black Masons in Oakville, which is outside of Moulton, the county seat of Lawrence County, decided that they would allow this statue to be erected on their little piece of property that went with the Masonic Hall. And so I went to Oakville to see this place, and it was a little cinder block building, maybe 3 or 4 houses around. It was a briar patch, pretty much. But they had the desire and wanted to see this statue there. Well, the statue was set in concrete and ready for the unveiling on a certain Saturday, and a pickup truck came by in the night, I think it was maybe 2 nights before the unveiling was scheduled, and did harm, pull the statue down, and it had to be redone. So, I don't know, every now and then I get optimistic, and I try to be. I can be a real Pollyanna about some things, but then a story like that will come along and, put your feet back on the ground, and I'll remember what Michael Grail said all over again. And because I have this license to fight, being from the South, I can go into shrill high dudgeon one more time, and I've done this pretty much my whole career. Ralph McGill had a formula for keeping people reading his column, even though his politics sometimes were on the liberal side. He said he wrote about coon dogs 3 days a week, and the rest of the time told people what they needed to read. So I pretty much adopted that formula. And I find that the longer I stay with it, the less I write about politics, just because, there is a sort of cycle, it seems to me, and it gets repetitious, and I get bored with it. But then somebody will write and say, I like it when you write about your grandmother's quilt, but do not write about politics. Well, of course, I have to write a political column after that. That's what keeps me writing political columns, is people telling me I have no business writing political columns. I'm perverse that way. My nephew Ben, when he was about 10, took me to this music store in an upscale Denver mall, and I'll never forget this. He was pointing out T-shirts that he liked and album covers, and he showed me, he said, this is really good stuff, Aunt Rheta. And he was 10, so this would have been 12 years ago. And the album covers he was showing me were like Bob Dylan and the Rolling Stones. And I remember he was convinced that this was his music, that this was the invention of his. He had no idea that I grew up on these same singers. And it's the same way in politics. And I feel that way about the Tea Party candidates. They think they are writing these lyrics. You know, George Wallace and Ross Barnett wrote these lyrics many decades ago. So, at least in my humble opinion. We sometimes think in the newspaper business that nobody pays any mind to what we say, and maybe they don't most days, but for a long time growing up in a little jewelry box, my best friend Connie Duncan had a grandfather who was a good woodworker, and for my birthday he made me a jewelry box, and I kept important papers and valentines and important things in that jewelry box. And one thing I kept in there for years, and I got the opportunity to tell him about this in Atlanta, but Ray Jenkins had written an editorial about Wallace, and I had kept this in that box for many, many years. It was written on, I had retyped his words on a manual typewriter, so that gives you some idea of how long I had had it. So I think when I feel bad sometimes that nothing ever changes and there is just repetition, I think about that. I think that maybe something I have said along the way might have a bit of impact and have changed some life or caused somebody else maybe to want to fight the things that are wrong in the region that we all love the most. As I said, staying in the South was part accident and part design. When I left Auburn, and Anna was very kind, my year as plainsman editor in 74-75 was also supposed to be the year I graduated. Well, I stopped attending classes. and then I had a chance to try to start a newspaper. My former husband, Jimmy Johnson, was a journalism graduate. He was already out and working at Opelika Auburn News the year I was plainsman editor and the year we got married in 1974. We honeymooned on this beautiful island, St. Simon's Island. Many of you know it, off the coast of Georgia. And we had one long weekend because I was editing the Plainsman and he was working at the OA News. So we went down to St. Simon's and, you know, we ate a few shrimp and looked around, but the main thing we noticed was that there was no real newspaper on that island. And we still had stars in our eyes and the voice of P.C. Burnett ringing in our ears, and he always told us, all you need to start a newspaper is a typewriter. And we thought to ourselves, well, we've got a typewriter. And this dollop of paradise has no newspaper. We totally discounted, being naive and on the editorial end of things, we totally discounted the two thriving shoppers that were on the island at that point, and I might add, are still on the island. We didn't think they counted at all. And they were talking about social events, and then the rest of the paper was devoted to ads. So we thought, well, this is great. We came home, and instead of showing people pictures we'd taken of boats and palm trees, we wrote a prospectus and gave it to Millard. And Millard Grimes, the editor of the Opelika Auburn News at that time, he's truly an unsung hero in my book. He really was a wonderful editor. He was sort of the Columbo of journalism, if you will. You know, you talk to him and you think he's not listening, he's not focusing. What his responses were just a little off. But he was a wonderful editor and had such a memory. When I gave up on interning for the Atlanta Constitution or the St. Pete Times, my first choices, I went to Millard. I had sort of put it off, and now I had to get an internship. And so I went to Millard and asked, do you have room for me to come do an internship? And he said, well, I don't know. And he started mumbling and walking around the little newsroom there. And I could tell he kept pointing at the desk. And finally came back, he said, yeah, I see we've got 8 garbage cans and we've got an extra desk. So that's how I was hired at the Opelika Auburn News. So I had interned there in the summer, and Jimmy had been working there. So we did this long study of the opportunities on St. Simon's Island, and one day we screwed up our courage and we went in and gave it to Millard, and he promised to look at it. A couple of days passed, and I'll never forget, he called us in, and one of the back shop paste-up women had